Oldsmobile. Before there was Ford, before there was Chevrolet, before there was basically anything we now associate with the modern car industry, there was Oldsmobile. Ransom Eli Olds founded the company in 1897, and what came out of his factory in those early years was genuinely world-changing. The Oldsmobile Curve Dash, built in 1901, is widely considered the first mass-produced automobile in history, the first time a car was made on something resembling an assembly line rather than being hand-built one at a time. Henry Ford gets most of the credit for industrializing car production, but Oldsmobile did it first. The brand kept innovating from there. They gave the world the first fully automatic transmission in 1940, the Hydra-Matic, which changed how ordinary people experienced driving forever. They introduced the first production V8 with an overhead valve design, which became the template every American performance engine would follow for decades. By the 1960s and 70s, the Oldsmobile Cutlass was one of the best-selling cars in the United States. So how does a brand that invented so much end up dead? Slowly, then all at once. By the 1990s, GM had started sharing platforms and parts between its brands to cut costs, and Oldsmobile lost whatever made it distinct. The cars started looking like Chevrolets with a different badge, and buyers noticed. Sales dropped year after year, and in 2000, GM announced it would end the brand entirely. The last Oldsmobile rolled off the line in 2004. A company that had been building cars since before most countries had paved roads was gone. Studebaker. The Studebaker story starts with wagons. Not cars, actual horse-drawn wagons, built by a family of German blacksmiths who settled in Indiana in the 1850s. Clement and Henry Studebaker were making wagon wheels and wagon frames, supplying the Union Army during the Civil War, and by the time the automobile arrived, they were already one of the largest vehicle manufacturers in the country. They pivoted to cars around 1902, and for the next 50 years, Studebaker built a reputation for being genuinely different. The Studebaker Avanti, introduced in 1962, was the fastest production car in America that year, capable of hitting 178 miles per hour in testing. It was sleek, modern, and unlike anything else on the road. The problem was timing. By the early 1950s, Studebaker was caught in a brutal price war between Ford and GM, two companies so much larger that they could afford to sell cars at a loss just to squeeze out competitors. Studebaker tried to survive by merging with Packard in 1954, which turned out to be a disaster for both companies. They were dragging each other down rather than holding each other up. The South Bend factory closed in 1963. And the last Studebaker ever built came off a Canadian assembly line on March 16, 1966, a Timberline turquoise four-door sedan that now sits in a museum. A company that had been making vehicles since Abraham Lincoln was president ended with a telegram to its remaining dealers saying the losses were simply too great to continue. Packard. If you owned a Packard in the 1920s or 1930s, you were someone. The company marketed itself with the slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," which tells you everything about how they position themselves. Packard was the American Rolls-Royce, an immaculately built, impossibly prestigious automobile for people who did not need to ask about the price. In 1903, when a standard Oldsmobile cost $650, a Packard cost $2,600. The company pioneered the modern steering wheel, introduced air conditioning to passenger cars, and put one of the first V12 engines into production. For a certain generation of wealthy Americans, nothing else was even worth considering. The decline started when Packard tried to reach a wider audience during the Great Depression by offering a cheaper model, the 120, priced under $1,000. The intention was survival, but the execution was brand suicide. Customers who had been willing to pay a premium for a Packard because it meant something started to see the name on affordable cars alongside ordinary buyers, and the prestige evaporated almost overnight. By the 1950s, Packard was weakened enough to merge with Studebaker, which was a company with its own financial problems. The two companies in trouble combined to make one company in worse trouble. The last true Packard was built in 1956. 2 years later, the name was gone. Tucker. Preston Tucker had one window of opportunity, and the world did everything it could to slam it shut. In 1947, Tucker unveiled the Tucker 48, and the automotive press lost its mind. Not because it was fast, though it was, but because it was safe in a way that no production car had ever been. Tucker fitted the car with a padded dashboard to absorb impact in a crash, a windshield designed to pop out in a collision rather than shatter into the occupants, a rear engine for better traction and balance, a central headlight that turned with the steering wheel, and a perimeter frame that protected passengers in a side impact. These are features that modern cars take for granted. In 1947, no other manufacturer was doing any of them. Tucker's factory in Chicago was producing cars, orders were coming in, and the company looked like it might actually challenge the big three. Then a Senate investigation, pushed along by people with very strong interests in seeing Tucker fail, accused the company of stock fraud. The investigation found nothing substantial enough to convict Tucker, who was acquitted of all charges. But the investigation had done its job. Investors pulled out, suppliers stopped shipping parts, and the banks closed their lines of credit. Only 51 Tucker 48s were ever built. Preston Tucker died of lung cancer in 1956, never having built another car. The safety features he pioneered would not become standard on American cars for another 20 years. DeLorean. John DeLorean was, by every measure, the most successful executive at General Motors in the 1960s. He turned Pontiac into a performance brand, gave the world the GTO, and became the youngest division head in GM's history. He was the kind of person the industry assumed would one day run the whole company. Instead, he quit and decided to build his own car. The DeLorean DMC-12, introduced in 1981, was genuinely striking. A stainless steel body, gull-wing doors, and a silhouette unlike anything else in production. The problem was that the car behind the styling was ordinary. The engine, a Renault Peugeot Volvo unit producing about 130 horsepower, was underpowered for a sports car costing that much. Quality control at the Belfast factory was poor, and the timing was brutal. The car launched just as a severe recession was hitting the US market hard. DeLorean was burning through money faster than the cars could generate it. In 1982, with the company on the edge of collapse, John DeLorean was filmed in a hotel room in what appeared to be a drug trafficking deal, arranged by an FBI informant. He was arrested. He was later acquitted, with the judge ruling that the FBI had entrapped him, but by then the company was finished. The factory closed and only around 9,000 DMC-12s had been built. The car found its second life in a movie about a time machine, and today a restored DeLorean sells for more than it ever did new. Pontiac. There was a time when Pontiac was the most exciting brand in the General Motors family, and that time was entirely the result of one man. John DeLorean, the same DeLorean who would later build his own car, arrived at Pontiac in the late 1950s, when the brand was producing slow, boring cars for people who wanted something between a Chevrolet and a Buick. He pushed through the GTO in 1964, which is widely considered the first true American muscle car, by putting a large V8 engine into a mid-sized body in a way the corporate rules technically did not permit. It sold phenomenally, and Pontiac was transformed almost overnight into the brand young people wanted. The Firebird, the Trans Am, the Formula, Pontiac stood for speed and excitement through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Then the oil crisis hit, and safety regulations tightened, and muscle cars became politically difficult. Pontiac spent the next 3 decades trying to find what it was supposed to be, swinging between sporty cars that were not sporty enough and ordinary cars that nobody needed a Pontiac for. By the 2000s, GM was quietly moving the brand toward a range of Australian-built vehicles to cut costs. The 2008 financial crisis forced GM into bankruptcy restructuring, and Pontiac was one of the brands that did not survive. The last Pontiac was built in 2010. The GTO that started everything would have been exactly the car to save it, but by the time they tried to revive it in 2004, it was too late. Saab. Saab did not start as a car company. It started as an aircraft manufacturer, Svenska Aeroplan Aktiebolaget, making warplanes for Sweden during World War II. When the war ended, the company needed something to make with all the engineering talent and factory space it had, and it decided to build a car. The first Saab, the 92, appeared in 1949 with an aerodynamic body that looked like it had been designed by people who understood airflow, because it had been. Saab spent the following decades building cars with genuine engineering signatures, turbocharged engines before turbocharging was fashionable, front-wheel drive layouts that prioritized traction in northern European winters, and an ignition key in the center console rather than the steering column for a reason that was actually sensible and rooted in aircraft cockpit design. Saab drivers were famously loyal, the kind of people who would drive nothing else, and found the brand's unconventional thinking to be a feature rather than a quirk. GM bought a stake in Saab in 1990 and full ownership by 2000, and in trying to make Saab more profitable, made it less Saab. Models began sharing platforms and parts with GM brands that had nothing to do with Sweden or aircraft engineering or any of the things Saab owners had been paying for. Sales fell. GM sold the company to Spyker, a Dutch manufacturer, in 2010, and when Saab needed fresh investment, a deal with a Chinese consortium fell through when GM refused to allow the transfer of technology. Without money, and without a buyer, Saab filed for bankruptcy in 2011. The name lives on in Swedish aerospace. The car brand does not. Rover. The Rover company began making bicycles in Coventry in the 1880s, moved to cars around 1904, and eventually became one of the most respected names in British motoring. For most of the 20th century, a Rover was exactly what a senior British professional drove: well-built, understated, quietly capable. The brand sat comfortably between the ordinary family car and full luxury, and at various points it owned some of the most desirable names in the business. Range Rover was a Rover product. Land Rover was a Rover product. At one point, so was Jaguar. The problem was that the British car industry of the 1970s and 1980s was in serious structural trouble, and Rover was caught in the middle of it. Ownership passed through British Leyland, then to British Aerospace, then to BMW, who bought the company in 1994 expecting a jewel and discovered something considerably less polished. BMW spent 5 years and billions of pounds trying to turn Rover around before selling the brand for a symbolic £10 in 2000. A private consortium called the Phoenix Four took over, paid themselves enormous salaries, and ran the company into the ground. Rover went into administration in 2005. The last car left the factory on April 15, 2005, and 8,000 workers lost their jobs in a matter of days. The name passed through Chinese ownership and various revival attempts, none of which came to anything lasting. Hummer. The Hummer exists because of the Gulf War. In 1991, the world watched AM General's high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, the Humvee, rolling through the Iraqi desert on television, and a specific type of American consumer decided they needed one. AM General began selling a civilian version, the H1, in 1992. It was enormous, impractical, spectacularly fuel inefficient, and it sold well. GM bought the brand from AM General in 1998 and introduced the H2, which was slightly smaller but retained the visual aggression that customers were paying for. The H2 and the later H3 sold in large numbers through the early 2000s, when fuel was cheap and the mood of the country was not particularly focused on environmental concerns. Then fuel prices spiked, the 2008 financial crisis hit, and the cultural moment that had made the Hummer relevant ended almost simultaneously. GM tried to sell the brand to a Chinese company called Sichuan Tengzhong Heavy Industrial Machinery, but the Chinese government blocked the deal. With no buyer and no future in GM's restructured lineup, Hummer was discontinued in 2010. The name came back in 2021 as an electric vehicle, which is about as complete a reversal of everything the original Hummer stood for as is possible to achieve: Saturn. In 1985, General Motors did something that no major American car company had done in decades. It created an entirely new brand from scratch. Saturn was built in Spring Hill, Tennessee, and from the beginning it was positioned as something different. Employee-owned, independently operated, focused on a no-haggle buying experience and customer relationships rather than transactions. The cars were made from polymer body panels that did not rust and would flex rather than dent. Saturn dealers gave customers a genuinely different experience from the rest of the industry, and for a while, it worked. Saturn owners were unusually loyal. The company cultivated a community feeling, holding homecoming events at the factory that thousands of customers traveled to attend. The problem was that GM never fully committed to letting Saturn be what it was supposed to be. The initial investment was enormous, and as the years passed, the bean counters won. Saturn started sharing platforms with other GM brands. The cars became less distinctive, and the reason for the brand's existence became harder to articulate. By the 2008 restructuring, GM had decided to sell Saturn to Penske Automotive. The deal collapsed at the last moment when Penske could not secure the manufacturing arrangements it needed. Saturn closed in 2010. The homecoming traditions stopped. The Spring Hill factory was eventually repurposed by GM to build other vehicles. Plymouth. Walter Chrysler created Plymouth in 1928 as an affordable entry point into the Chrysler family, positioned to compete directly with Ford and Chevrolet at the lower end of the market. For a long time, it worked remarkably well. Plymouth found its moment during the Great Depression, when buyers needed reliable, cheap transportation and did not have much room for brand loyalty. The Plymouth Fury, the Plymouth Barracuda, the Plymouth Roadrunner, these were cars that defined American driving culture at various points across 40 years. By the late 1990s, however, Chrysler had so many brands doing similar things that the individual identities had blurred beyond distinction. Plymouth and Dodge were selling what were essentially the same cars with different names. The engineers called it badge engineering. The customers called it confusing, and the accountants eventually called it unsustainable. Chrysler discontinued Plymouth in 2001 after its parent company, Daimler Chrysler, decided to focus resources on the brands that still meant something specific to buyers. The Neon, the Breeze, the Prowler, Plymouth's last cars drove off dealership lots, and the brand simply ceased to exist. Nobody owned the trademark afterward, and no serious revival attempt has materialized. Mercury. Ford created Mercury in 1938 to fill a gap in its lineup, something above the standard Ford models but below the premium Lincoln range. For a brief and genuinely exciting period, Mercury meant something. James Dean owned one. The Mercury in the 1950s was the car of the young and the restless, a vehicle with enough style to feel special without costing what a Lincoln cost. By the 1960s, Mercury was competing at the middle of the market alongside Oldsmobile and Dodge, and it was doing reasonably well. Then the same forces that killed Oldsmobile and Plymouth started working on Mercury. Badge engineering, shared platforms, a disappearing identity. The Mercury Sable was essentially a Ford Taurus with a different badge. The Mercury Mountaineer was essentially a Ford Explorer. By the time Ford was considering what to do about Mercury in the 2000s, the brand's remaining customers were overwhelmingly older, and the pipeline of younger buyers who might have replaced them had never materialized. Ford ended Mercury in 2010. After 72 years, the last Mercury rolled off the line in January 2011, a Grand Marquis, the same car it had been building for decades, a car that had simply aged out of relevance. AMC, the American Motors Corporation, was born in 1954 from the merger of Nash Kelvinator and Hudson Motor Company, and at the time it was the largest corporate merger in American history. AMC's strategy was simple and genuinely smart. Do not try to compete with General Motors, Ford and Chrysler head-on, because you will lose. Instead, find the gaps they are not filling and fill them. In the late 1950s, when the Big Three were producing massive chrome-laden land yachts, AMC pivoted to compact, fuel-efficient cars, a decision that looked eccentric at the time and looked prescient when fuel prices rose. The AMX was a genuine performance car. The Javelin competed respectably in racing, and the AMC Eagle, introduced in 1979, is historically significant in a way that the company never got proper credit for. It was America's first car to combine a raised ride height, all-wheel drive, and a car-based body into a single vehicle. That is a description of every crossover SUV sold today. AMC invented the crossover concept decades before it became the dominant form of passenger vehicle on Earth. Chrysler bought AMC in 1988, primarily to acquire the Jeep brand, which AMC had purchased in 1970. The AMC name disappeared immediately. Jeep survived and thrived. The company that invented the modern crossover is largely forgotten. Fisker. Henrik Fisker was already famous in the car world before he started a company with his own name. He had designed the BMW Z8, the Aston Martin DB9, and several other cars that people considered genuinely beautiful. When he founded Fisker Automotive in 2007, the intention was to build an electric luxury car that was desirable in the same way those cars were desirable, not because it was efficient or responsible, but because it was genuinely beautiful and worth wanting. The Fisker Karma, introduced in 2012, was a plug-in hybrid with a stunning silhouette that received genuine attention and genuine praise for how it looked. The problems were everywhere else: battery fires, reliability issues, a recall of every Karma ever built, the bankruptcy of the company's battery supplier, A123 Systems, and damage to hundreds of cars in Hurricane Sandy combined to destroy both the finances and the reputation of the company simultaneously. Fisker Automotive filed for bankruptcy in 2013, and the assets were purchased by a Chinese company. Henrik Fisker started again, founding Fisker Inc. in 2016 and introducing the Fisker Ocean SUV in 2022, a fully electric vehicle that attracted significant interest. That company also collapsed into bankruptcy in 2024, with production stopping and dealers left with unsold inventory. Two companies, two failures, one designer who built some of the most admired vehicles of his generation. Lancia. Vincenzo Lancia founded his company in Turin in 1906, and what he built over the following decades was something the automotive world had genuinely never seen. Lancia pioneered the narrow V4 and narrow V6 engine configurations, invented the sliding pillar independent front suspension, was among the first manufacturers to use a unitary body construction rather than a body-on-frame design, and spent decades producing cars that engineers around the world studied and borrowed from. In rally racing, Lancia became a force that rewrote what was possible. The Stratos in the 1970s, the 037 in the early 1980s, the Delta HF Integrail, which won the World Rally Championship 6 consecutive times. Fiat acquired Lancia in 1969, and for a time the brand continued to produce remarkable cars. Over the following decades, however, Fiat began using Lancia as a badge for rebodied Fiats, stripping away the engineering distinction that had made the name meaningful. By the 2010s, Lancia's entire lineup in most markets consisted of a single model, the Ypsilon, which was essentially a Fiat with different trim. The brand that had invented half the technical vocabulary of modern automotive engineering was selling one small city car. Stellantis, the company that now owns Lancia, has announced plans to revive the brand with genuinely distinct electric vehicles. Whether that revival will carry any of what made Lancia worth caring about remains an open question.